February 1956. Two voices exploded onto American radio within weeks of each other. One became the king of rock and roll, died at 42 in a mansion, and left behind an empire worth billions. The other became a footnote, died at 25 on a bathroom floor, and was buried in an unmarked grave his family couldn't afford to mark. Same year, same breakthrough, same revolution. But the industry only protected one of them. This is the story of 1956, when America chose who deserved the crown and who deserved to disappear. Frankie Lymon was 13 years old when he walked into a recording studio on West 54th Street in Manhattan on a cold January morning in 1956. He was so short the engineers had to lower the microphone stand to its absolute minimum, and even then he had to stand on his toes to reach it. His voice hadn't changed yet, still had that pure, unbroken soprano that could hit notes most adult singers couldn't dream of reaching. The song was called "Why Do Fools Fall in Love," and nobody in that room, not the producers, not the session musicians, not even Frankie himself, understood that they were recording something that would still be playing 70 years later. 3 weeks later, 900 miles south in Nashville, Elvis Presley walked into RCA Studio B. He was 21, significantly older than Frankie, but still young enough to be dismissed as a fad. He had slicked back hair, a nervous energy, and a song called "Heartbreak Hotel" that his manager, Colonel Tom Parker, believed could change everything. The engineers watched this kid from Tupelo, Mississippi, shake his leg while he sang, and they thought he looked ridiculous. But when he opened his mouth and that voice came out, low and aching and dangerous, they stopped laughing. Both records hit stores in February 1956. Both climbed the charts like rockets. By March, you couldn't turn on a radio without hearing one or both of them. Teenage girls screamed for both. Parents condemned both. The music industry, still reeling from the shock of rock and roll, suddenly had two very different faces of the same revolution. But here's what nobody talks about. Here's the part that history textbooks leave out, the part that gets buried under Elvis documentaries and ignored in Frankie Lymon obituaries. These two boys didn't just share a breakthrough year, they shared the same stages, competed for the same audiences, and represented two completely different versions of what America was willing to accept in 1956. Frankie Lymon was black, Elvis Presley was white. And in 1956 America, that difference wasn't just about skin color. It was about who got protection, who got investment, who got a future, and who got used up and thrown away. The Teenagers, Frankie's group, hit #1 on the R&B charts in March. "Why Do Fools Fall in Love" was everywhere. Black radio stations, white radio stations, jukeboxes in segregated diners where Frankie couldn't eat, but his voice could play. The song was infectious, innocent, the kind of thing that made you smile even if you didn't want to. And at the center of it all was this 13-year-old kid from Harlem who sang like he'd been doing it for decades. Elvis hit #1 on the country charts, then crossed over to pop. Heartbreak Hotel was darker, heavier, sexual in a way that made parents nervous and teenagers obsessed. Ed Sullivan said he'd never put Elvis on television. 6 months later, he paid him $50,000 to appear, then famously filmed him only from the waist up because his hips were too dangerous for American living rooms. Both of them became instant celebrities. Both of them were suddenly national news. But the infrastructure around them, the machinery of fame, the people controlling their careers, those were radically different. Elvis had Colonel Tom Parker, a former carnival barker who understood one thing better than anyone else in the music business: protect the product. Parker negotiated contracts that gave Elvis control. Not full control. Parker made sure he got his cut, but enough control that Elvis owned his image, owned his music, owned his future. Parker got Elvis into RCA Records with a deal that included royalty guarantees, publishing rights, and creative input. Parker got Elvis into Hollywood with contracts that paid him more per film than most established actors. Parker built a fortress around Elvis Presley, and that fortress was made of lawyers, accountants, and ironclad contracts. Frankie Lymon had Morris Levy, a mobster who owned roulette records and made his fortune by stealing from artists who were too young, too black, too powerless to fight back. Levy saw Frankie Lymon the way you see a lottery ticket. You cash it in, you pocket the money, you throw away the paper. The contract Frankie signed at 13 years old gave him almost nothing. No publishing rights, no royalty guarantees. A flat fee per performance that seemed like a fortune to a kid from Harlem who'd never seen that much money before, but was actually pennies compared to what the song was generating. Frankie's mother asked to see the contract. Levy's people told her it was standard industry practice. She couldn't read legal language anyway. She trusted them. She signed as his guardian. And with that signature, she handed her son's future to a man who would make millions off his voice and give him nothing in return. By summer of 1956, both Frankie and Elvis were touring. Both were playing to sold-out crowds. Both were being mobbed by fans. But the tours themselves revealed the difference in how America saw them. Elvis toured the South, played segregated venues where white teenagers screamed and fainted, played theaters that wouldn't let black audience members through the front door, played shows where black musicians who influenced him couldn't perform, and he got paid premium rates, stayed in nice hotels, traveled in comfort. The infrastructure of segregation worked in his favor because he was white, and the industry invested in making his comfort a priority. Frankie toured the same circuit. The Chitlin Circuit, they called it. Black theaters, black audiences, venues that white performers wouldn't touch because they were considered beneath them. Frankie played the Apollo Theater in Harlem, played the Howard Theater in Washington, D.C., played segregated venues across the country where he was the star on stage but couldn't eat in the restaurant afterward. He was 13 years old, making grown men millions of dollars, and he couldn't order a sandwich in half the cities where he performed. And the money he was making, the money he thought he was making, was disappearing. Morris Levy controlled the accounts. Told Frankie's family they were investing it for him, setting him up for the future. But there was no investment. There was only extraction. Here's what was happening behind the scenes. What Frankie wouldn't understand until it was too late. Why Do Fools Fall in Love was generating massive royalties. Radio play, record sales, jukebox plays, international licensing. The song was a gold mine. Morris Levy was collecting all of it and paying Frankie a fraction of a fraction. Elvis, meanwhile, was building wealth. Real wealth. Colonel Parker made sure Elvis got paid. Made sure RCA couldn't cheat him, made sure every contract had teeth. Parker was a predator in his own right, took a massive percentage of Elvis's earnings, but he understood that a protected Elvis was a profitable Elvis, so he protected him. By the end of 1956, Elvis bought his mother a house, bought himself a Cadillac, started looking at properties in Memphis. His financial future was being constructed, brick by brick, contract by contract. Frankie, by the end of 1956, was still living in the same apartment in Harlem. His family was still struggling. The money from Why Do Fools Fall in Love was supposed to have changed everything, but nothing had changed. His mother asked Morris Levy's people where the money was going. They showed her paperwork she couldn't understand and told her everything was being handled professionally. But 1956 wasn't just about money and contracts. It was about something more insidious. It was about how fame was being constructed, who was being built to last, and who was being used up. Elvis was being positioned as the future. The industry looked at him and saw longevity, saw movies, Vegas residencies, a decades-long career. They invested in his image, crafted his brand, protected his reputation. When Elvis got into trouble, and he did, the Colonel cleaned it up. When Elvis made mistakes, the industry gave him second chances, because they saw him as an investment worth protecting. Frankie was being positioned as a novelty, a cute kid with a great voice. The industry looked at him and saw a temporary phenomenon. They didn't plan for his future because they didn't believe he had one. Child stars were expendable in 1956, especially black child stars. The plan was simple: extract maximum profit while the voice was marketable, then move on to the next one. And Frankie could feel it, even at 13, could feel the difference in how he was treated versus how white performers were treated, could feel the hollowness of the applause, the way people loved his voice but didn't see him as a person, could feel how disposable he was. He'd watch Elvis on television, watch Ed Sullivan introduce him, watch the screaming fans, watch the way Elvis was being elevated to icon status. And Frankie would think, we both did the same thing. We both had hits. Why is he being treated like the future, and I'm being treated like the present? The answer was obvious, but saying it out loud in 1956 was dangerous. The answer was race. The answer was that America was willing to let a white boy become a king, but a black boy, no matter how talented, was only allowed to be a court jester. Perform, entertain, then disappear. By 1957, the divergence was becoming clear. Elvis was in Hollywood filming Loving You, his first major film. Colonel Parker had negotiated a 3-picture deal with Paramount. Elvis was being groomed for mainstream superstardom, positioned to transcend music and become a full entertainment brand. Frankie was still touring, but the novelty was wearing off. He was 14 now, and his voice was starting to change. That pure soprano that made Why Do Fools Fall in Love magical was deepening, cracking, becoming unstable. And Morris Levy, who'd made his fortune off that voice, started losing interest. This is where the cruelty of the industry revealed itself. Elvis's voice matured, deepened, and the industry celebrated it. Reinvented him as a more mature performer. Gave him ballads, gave him movie roles that matched his evolution, invested in his transition from teen idol to adult star. Frankie's voice changed, and the industry abandoned him. No reinvention, no investment in his growth. Just a cold calculation that he was no longer profitable in the same way. Morris Levy stopped returning phone calls, stopped booking premium venues, started treating Frankie like a has-been at 14 years old. And Frankie didn't understand. He was still talented, still could sing, still had the same drive, the same passion. But the infrastructure that had briefly elevated him was gone. Because it was never about him. It was about what he could generate, and once that stream slowed, he became irrelevant. Elvis, at 22, was getting drafted into the Army, and even that became a branding opportunity. The Colonel made sure Elvis's military service was publicized, patriotic, career-enhancing, made sure he served but didn't disappear, made sure when he came back he'd be bigger than ever. And he was. Elvis returned from the Army in 1960 and immediately landed a contract with NBC for a special that revitalized his career. Frankie, at 16, was trying to figure out how to survive. The teenagers had broken up. Morris Levy had moved on to other artists. The money Frankie thought was being saved for him didn't exist. His family was asking him to contribute to rent, to food, to bills. And he had nothing. The boy who'd sung for millions, whose voice still played on radios around the world, was broke. He tried to go solo, cut a few records that went nowhere. The industry wasn't interested. They'd extracted what they needed from Frankie Lymon, and now they were done. At 16, his career was effectively over. This is when the spiral began. This is when the trajectory that would end in a bathroom in Harlem 9 years later started to form. Because what do you do when you've been famous, when you've tasted that validation, when you've heard thousands of people scream your name, and then suddenly it all stops? When you're 16 years old and you're already a has-been? You try to recapture it, you chase it, you become desperate for it. And when you can't find it through music, you find it other ways. Frankie discovered heroin in 1958. He was 17. Started using because everyone around him in the Harlem music scene was using. Started using because it made him feel good when nothing else did. Started using because fame had given him a taste of euphoria, and drugs were the only thing that replicated that feeling. Elvis discovered pills around the same time. Amphetamines to stay awake during filming, barbiturates to sleep, painkillers for various ailments. But Elvis had doctors prescribing them, had the colonel monitoring his health, had people around him who needed him functional because he was worth too much to lose. Elvis's drug use was managed, enabled, but contained within a system that still needed him alive. Frankie's drug use was ignored. Nobody around him had a financial incentive to keep him healthy. Morris Levy had already made his money. There was no Colonel Parker protecting the asset. There was just a 17-year-old kid with a heroin addiction and no support system. By 1959, Frankie was trying to get clean, tried to enlist in the army, thought military structure might save him. He got in, but his addiction followed him. He was discharged. Came back to New York more lost than before. Elvis, meanwhile, was in Germany, serving honorably, photographed with other soldiers, maintaining the wholesome image that would serve him for decades. The contrast was becoming a chasm. One path led up, the other led down. And the difference had nothing to do with talent. Frankie Lymon at 13 was as talented as Elvis Presley at 21, arguably more naturally gifted. But talent without infrastructure is just potential, and America had decided which potential was worth investing in. Through the early 1960s, Frankie made attempts at comebacks, small club gigs, recording sessions that went nowhere. He'd show up, still had flashes of the old magic, but the addiction was winning. Heroin doesn't care about talent. It doesn't care about potential, it just takes. Elvis was making movies. Not good movies mostly, but profitable ones. Was playing Vegas, was building Graceland into a palace, was becoming not just a star, but an institution. And Frankie was becoming invisible. The boy who'd outsold Elvis in 1956 was now playing to crowds of 20 people in clubs that smelled like smoke and desperation. The voice that had made Morris Levy a millionaire was now begging for $50 gigs. Here's what nobody tells you about child stardom. Here's what gets lost in the glamour and the headlines. When you're given fame that young, you don't develop the tools to handle its loss. You don't build an identity outside of being famous. So when it's taken away, you don't know who you are anymore. Frankie Lymon, at 23, didn't know who he was. Was he the kid who sang "Why Do Fools Fall in Love"? Was he the has-been junkie? Was he the talent that could have been? He'd try to answer that question by getting high, and the high would make him forget the question for a while, and then he'd come down and the question would be waiting. Elvis, at 30, had the same identity crisis. The movies were becoming jokes. The music was becoming stale. He was trapped in a system that had made him rich but kept him artistically imprisoned. He'd sit in Graceland, surrounded by wealth, and feel empty, feel like a product instead of a person. But Elvis had resources to navigate that crisis, had people around him, had options, could reinvent himself, and eventually did with the 1968 comeback special. Frankie had nothing, had burned through every relationship, had alienated his family, had no money, no prospects, no path forward. February 27, 1968. Frankie Lymon was found dead in his grandmother's bathroom in Harlem. He was 25 years old. The official cause was a heroin overdose, but the real cause was more complicated. The real cause was an industry that had used him, extracted his value, and discarded him. The real cause was a system that protected white talent and consumed black talent. The real cause was 1956, when two boys became famous, and America decided one deserved a crown and the other deserved nothing. His funeral was small. His family could barely afford it. Morris Levy, the man who'd made millions off Frankie's voice, didn't attend, didn't send flowers, didn't acknowledge that the boy he'd exploited had died. Why Do Fools Fall in Love was still playing on oldies stations, still generating royalties, still making money for everyone except Frankie's family. He was buried in an unmarked grave. His family couldn't afford a headstone. For years, the boy who'd sung for millions didn't even have a name on his grave. Elvis died 9 years later, in 1977. He was 42. His death made international headlines. Presidents mourned him. The world stopped. He was buried at Graceland in a grave that became a pilgrimage site. His estate, eventually managed properly after the colonel's death, became worth over $1 billion. Two voices from 1956, both gone too young, but only one remembered as a king. Here's what history forgot or chose to ignore. In 1956, Frankie Lymon's Why Do Fools Fall in Love outsold Elvis's Heartbreak Hotel in several markets. Frankie was on magazine covers, was breaking attendance records, was every bit the phenomenon Elvis was. But the industry saw them differently, invested in them differently, protected one and exploited the other. And that difference, that fundamental difference in how America valued them, determined everything that came after. Some people say Frankie would have fallen into drugs regardless. That child stardom destroys everyone. That addiction doesn't discriminate. And maybe there's truth in that. But Elvis had addiction too, had the same pressures, had the same identity crisis. The difference was the infrastructure around him, the system that needed him alive. Frankie had no such system, because the system never planned for his longevity, never saw him as worth the investment, used him up and moved on. In 1981, Diana Ross starred in a television movie called Why Do Fools Fall in Love, a fictionalized version of Frankie's life. It painted him as tragic, but ultimately responsible for his own destruction. It barely mentioned Morris Levy, barely mentioned the contracts, barely mentioned the systemic exploitation. In 1984, Frankie Lymon was finally given a headstone. His family had saved for years to afford it. It reads, Frankie Lymon, 1942-1968, singer. That's it. No mention of Why Do Fools Fall in Love. No mention of the millions who loved his voice. Just singer. Elvis's grave reads, Elvis Aaron Presley, the king of rock and roll. Both true, both earned. But only one got to keep the crown. Today, music historians talk about 1956 as the year rock and roll exploded. They talk about Elvis as the revolutionary. And he was. But they forget or ignore that there were other revolutionaries that year, other voices that mattered, other talents that deserved protection. Frankie Lymon deserved better, deserved managers who saw him as a human being, not a profit margin, deserved contracts that protected him instead of enslaving him, deserved an industry that invested in his future instead of extracting his present. He deserved to grow old, to see his grandchildren, to perform Why Do Fools Fall in Love at 70 with a voice deepened by age and wisdom, to tell his own story instead of having it told for him. But 1956 decided differently, decided that one voice deserved protection and longevity, and the other deserved to shine briefly and disappear. The song still plays. Why Do Fools Fall in Love is immortal. You hear it in movies, commercials, oldies stations. It never died. But the boy who sang it did, at 25, alone, broke, forgotten by the industry that had made him famous, and the industry that killed him still collects royalties from his voice every single day. That's the story of 1956. Not just about two talents, but about which talent America chose to protect and which one it chose to destroy.